Adam, I know the last week or so you've been having several interviews with various insiders and people who have contact with Mt. Gox. Have you been able to talk to these individuals or Gox itself to find out how open they are to using something like Goxcoins or using an outside system like this to provide liquidity and maybe even some kind of funds for these people, some kind of recompensation?
I have no proprietary information from Mt. Gox. My impression is that they are in full-on bunker mode, and that they're just, again, I think that there's a criminal investigation going on. I think that, they've got the bankruptcy proceedings going on. All of those things basically say that it almost doesn't really matter what Gox wants to do or Mark Karpellis wants to do. They're going to shut up, and they're not going to say really much of anything because they can't. So, to David's point, I wanted to quickly kind of mention one of the earlier concepts that was kicked around for this idea and why we didn't go with it. One of the ideas has been to take Mt. Gox and everybody who has coins in it and turn those into equity, and then a new exchange that would be run by the community and would be run as a for-profit exchange that would pay fees back to the shareholders. And in this way, if the new Gox succeeded, then it would, pay back shareholders over time, and they would potentially profit because they would still own the shares even after they were paid back with the dividend. The problem with this is that it requires Mt. Gox to actually be a functional exchange. And I don't really think that that's ever going to be a good solution. It doesn't really matter if they rebrand, doesn't really matter if they completely change their team. I think that in any scenario where they relaunched as a community-run exchange, they would have a completely new team and all that stuff would be true. But it's just not that good a solution. It's better instead to focus on the things that we can control, which is that they have this huge problem that we don't understand the depth of, and very, very few people, even people who should know, apparently don't understand the depth of, and it's going to be confusing for a long time. So rather than going down this hole where we say, okay, well, we'll just say all these people who lost funds, they're shareholders, and then we'll bring in new money, and then they'll capitalize the business, and then they'll be shareholders along with everybody else. That is so many moving parts and requires people to make bad economic decisions in order to invest in it in the first place. You do that because you feel bad. You do this because this is real. This reflects real value, and the value is whatever is going to wind up being recovered. Like I said before, that value is out there in the wild, and it's in the wrong hands. It's in the hands of people to whom it does not belong. Those situations will rectify themselves in Bitcoin. We just haven't really seen a good enough reason to develop the tools yet, but I bet you this is it.
That's a very powerful statement there. So out of curiosity, what kind of, for the listeners out there, what kind of talent or skill or human capital or is this team of yours looking for right now? Are you guys looking for lawyers, accountants, people who specialize in digging through big data? What can people talk about, or how can they bring resources to you?
That's a really good question. I think at this point, we're not looking for that much help. We're just trying to finish getting the plan in order and then seeing if Gox is willing to work with us. And if not, then we'll proceed in ways that don't require them to work with us.
Yeah, I'd say that's a good way to summarize it. Really, the ball is sort of in their court. The goal for this week is to raise awareness about this proposal, so that the community can encourage Gox to go down this road. If they don't, then this is going to go forward one way or another, probably as something issued unilaterally by one of the groups running the class action. And so that's the road forward. Either Gox is going to do the right thing and provide the information about everybody's accounts, or they're not, and then the community sort of has to do this unilaterally. It would move faster. It would be cleaner if Gox participates, and I really do encourage them to seriously consider this. And if they don't, it's going to take longer, and the account information is going to have to come out as part of court proceedings and lawsuits and things like that. So, but either way, I think Peter made a good point. This is a new technology that we can use for this purpose, and it's a lot better than the existing options. And so one way or another, this technology is going to get used for this type of application into the future. And this is sort of just the most pressing need that our community has at the moment. And so it seems like a really good use case for something like this.
The technology, like you said, just this kind of secondary protocol didn't exist to allow it in the first place. You guys have been around for, 6 months? So, Peter, I had a question for you with respect to the history of this kind of thing. How does this kind of recovery happen in the traditional brick and mortar world, where you do have these different investigations and you have these different lawyers and litigators and you have this whole process of interaction? How does that usually take place in the real world?
Typically what happens is where you have this kind of thing happen is when an issuer, a company, has debt outstanding and it either defaults on that debt. This is one of the areas where attorneys tend to get involved. Is any company that has debt debt outstanding is going to have some definitions as to what constitutes a default. It could be a late payment. It could be no payment. In some cases, it could be something somewhat more exotic. Generally speaking, what constitutes a default would be not making a dividend payment, that sort of thing. Or, sometimes they can go up for review if their credit rating drops. But it's interesting because one of the things that David said that I was chomping at the bit to jump in on is, and this is the same, by the way, as with debt defaults. Almost nobody is going to be made completely whole. And likely the amounts are going to be probably somewhat on the low side. And an example I have is from when I was trading during the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, 2009. Suddenly there were a record number of firms which were, it travels in cycles. As we have bad economies, suddenly there's a rush of firms which default on their debt. And then all of a sudden, all these things are brought into play and there's hearings. And then the companies, either they come up with a restructuring plan or sometimes they're liquidated or that type of thing. But anyway, I remember that the estimate that was used, sort of the default estimate, and by the way, this was considered pessimistic, in most of the credit default swaps, which sort of serve as the barometer of the likelihood of default on publicly traded debt, was about 40 cents to the dollar. One of the first deals, I don't remember the exact firm, but I do remember the number. Once the proceedings were done, it turned out that the actual recovery was not 40 cents on the dollar, but 8 cents on the dollar. I certainly don't know what's going to happen in this case, but I would say that it's probably something to be sanguine about. More to your question, it's a much messier process than this, involving not only attorneys, but also, like I said, sometimes there's a dispute over what constitutes a default. I mean, usually it's pretty straightforward, whether you're a secured creditor or a general creditor or so on, but sometimes there are controversies about who should be paid or who's at fault and that sort of thing. This is, by comparison, much cleaner, much more straightforward. Better yet, it's really going to be defined by the market. It's going to be market-driven rather than a result of litigation to exhaustion.
Wow, 40% on the dollar. That actually seems quite high compared to what I remember seeing Bitcoin Builder. That was like 4 cents on the dollar. So
yeah, the estimate was 40 cents, and the actual number wound up being 8 cents. And I remember people telling me that 40 cents was probably on the low end, that the number would be much higher. But actually, as it turned out, the number was vastly lower.
Well, but where did that number come from? I think that's a really important question because, like, again, here we have the market saying, okay, there's a 4 cent on the dollar recovery if you're buying at this exchange. But I mean, like, I think that kind of proves the point that you're making, right, Peter?
If I remember correctly, and in this case, I'm usually not, but in this case, I'm quite true. The 40 cents was a number that was derived from the past cycle of defaults, which is really quite a specious basis because you're talking about different companies and the different state that balance sheets are in. And certainly the nature of the financial crisis in 2008 was very different than what we had between, say, 1990 and 1992 or so. And we could go into a whole discussion about past information and its bearing on present day or in the future. But that's where that number came from. The 40 cent number that was used is pretty much standard in many of the credit default swaps at the time turned out being, like I said, much, much higher than it actually was. And I have a feeling that in the next crisis, when it inevitably comes, what we'll find is that the numbers being used in this time are probably on the low side. But who knows? Again, who knows? And I think that's the point.
Adam, since you guys are looking at the first application as Goxcoin, what other companies do you think this could help out with? Do you think this could, even if you have a firm that's not working in conjunction with the crypto ledger or crypto protocol, maybe, for example, like RIM, that make BlackBerries and so on, they're supposedly going to be going bankrupt. Do you think, is there a way you could create a BlackBerry coin to help them organize their own bankruptcy if they end up going through a horrible mess? Or is this only being able to be applied to organizations that have completely gone, like you said, into turtle mode, to this barricade mode?
Well, I think that it's partly about the barricade mode, and mostly it's just about if it's crypto or not. I think that really has a lot to do with it. You could have a BlackBerry do something like this, but everybody would have to agree. And having that happen seems kind of unlikely. So it's better that these solutions, like once these are more developed and people have seen them succeed, then yeah, I think this will be viewed as a preferable option to a lot of other options that are out there, simply because it never traps you. That's really the thing here. We're trying to give people options so that even if they're not great options, they at least have some options, because there's nothing worse than being trapped in a situation where you know that you're not only screwed, but you're going to be for years. Some people would just rather completely get out of that, even if it is just a couple pennies on the dollar, so they can not have that stress in their life. So again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, The point is that we don't know what's going on now. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. And this is the only solution that doesn't require us to know either of those things in order to still make a good decision.
Basically, that's all you can do with this nebulous framework. Speaking of which, David, maybe the listeners would like to know a little bit more about how the protocol actually works with this. I understand you guys are issuing one-time only Gox coins. How does your protocol keep track of these? Like the transparency side might be something listeners may be interested in.
So let me give you a little background on the Master protocol. Master is actually an acronym for metadata archival by standard transaction embedding records. And that's literally exactly what the protocol does. It's embedding records using standard transactions into the Bitcoin blockchain. And so these are actually Bitcoin transactions, but they're not regular Bitcoin transactions, right? They've got a little bit of metadata attached. And so the software, when you download Master Protocol wallet or client, can say, oh, that's not a regular transaction. That's a Master coin, or that's a Gox coin, or that's a storage coin, or whatever user currency person is identifying. And so basically we're using Bitcoin as a cryptographic ledger. And that sort of adds a lot of value to Bitcoin in itself. Right now, the two major values for Bitcoin are a payment network and a store of wealth. But it's also a great cryptographic ledger to store records of valuable financial assets. And this is sort of a really good example of that. So the way that the Master Protocol works is people can issue user currencies on top of it. And basically what they're doing is they're just getting a identification number for this particular currency. So let's say this gets issued as the third user currency on the Master Protocol. The beginning of that metadata would identify it as a number 3 user currency. And so it could be identified as this is a Goxcoin. And so this can be done without any changes to the Bitcoin protocol. This works within the standard transaction architecture for Bitcoin. And I think this is a really important use case for Bitcoin because I think it adds an enormous amount of value to be able to transfer financial assets on the ledger and not just things over the payment network and not just holding Bitcoins as a store of wealth. I think that's sort of the third great use case that we're going to see for Bitcoin is this general ledger that stores this information. The Master Protocol, all it's doing is interpreting that data. It's a standard by which we're interpreting that information. So all of the records are just as transparent as the Bitcoin ledger. So you can see the coins moving back and forth from different addresses as people move them. But just like Bitcoin, it's synonymous, where there's no personally identifiable information attached to the transaction. And so it's just numbers going back and forth. So it's transparent in the sense that we can see funds moving around and we can see what people are trading them for. If they're using the Master Protocol distributed exchange, they can actually offer these tokens for other tokens, for Bitcoin or for Mastercoin or for other cryptocurrencies and trade them on the Bitcoin ledger itself. And you don't have any third party or other exchange that you have to trust. Those are records that are all kept on top of Bitcoin. So that's sort of just a general overview of how it works. It's still in the early stages. The protocol was launched about 6 months ago. The distributed exchange was in testing right now and will be launched later this month, and the user currencies are in development too. And so this is all sort of just becoming possible on the technology side, and I think that's why we're seeing this as the first time people are proposing to use it.
Right. And that was why we pulled in Mastercoin, is because there are several other protocols that are all going to offer kind of similar options. But the reality is that Master Protocol has the stuff ready. They have white label wallets. So, if we're ready to go on this from the Gox side, then we're going to be ready to go on this from the technology side. And that wasn't true of any other protocol we were really looking at.
You're right. My own research I understand that with who's ready and who's not. Peter, how would you think the adoption in the financial industry would be towards something like using this in a financial institution? For example, some people I've spoken to think you could use a crypto ledger internally to track assets at large financial institutions. So if you did have some kind of bankruptcy like this or some kind of horrible failure, maybe combining with what Adam said, the reason this could work in this situation is because Mt. Gox was using, cryptocurrencies. Do you think that in the future, if financial institutions would accept this kind of ledger system internally, it could be used this way? Or do you think they're too conservative for that right now?
To be honest, I think that this is a much better fit for financial institutions than what seems like the straightforward use, which is as a currency. I don't see many big banks wanting to replace fiat currencies for any number of reasons. I won't get into all of them, wanting to replace those with cryptocurrencies. However, I do think that there is a potential application as an accounting tool and as a way of keeping track of contingent liabilities and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so it's going along that line just for a few minutes, if we could speculate with Lehman or Bear Stearns. I know it's obviously it was a long, 6 years ago, so it's hard to gauge whether or not they would have done something like that. But if they had used their back office was using something like this to keep track of, would that even have prevented the, quote unquote explosion of these assets, or would it allow them to liquidate better? Is there any advantage of using this internally? With respect to Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, there's two different situations. Bear Stearns collapsed because of a crisis of confidence, and I don't think there was anything, whether in the fiat currency world or in cryptocurrencies, that would have saved them. With Lehman Brothers, the problems came about. There was also a crisis of currency, of confidence, but also they were unable to roll their paper, their commercial paper, and because of that, they faced a liquidity crisis. And to the extent that cryptocurrencies might, for example, help them to, I guess, gauge their credit worthiness on the street. If it was more responsive than, say, credit default swaps or something like that, it would be helpful. But I think for right now, cryptocurrencies are probably a better fit in terms of accounting than in terms of use as an actual currency for big banks and large financial institutions. But in this particular case, it's more after the fact. I think this is much cleaner, more straightforward than, say, the going courts and all the different types of claims that have to be filed and all that sort of thing. I see. Yeah, because the whole accounting issue is really interesting. Kind of like not an accounting coin, but you use it as a third-party ledger that can't be abused. And Adam, I know part of your the Human project, you're using different types of tokens, different types of issuance. How can you see financial institutions, particularly exchanges or fiat banks of some kind, using some of these kind of technologies internally, or do you see them have any motivation or incentive to adopt something like this, so that way they could interface with this growing cryptocurrency ecosystem?
I think that what we're going to see is that cryptocurrencies provide transparency, pseudonymous transparency, in a way that we've never had a financial technology be able to do before. It literally, you can completely open the kimono and see all of the flows without seeing the specifics of it, and therefore being able to ascertain the exact business practices. The potential for companies to embrace this and to demonstrate solvency essentially by putting themselves out there, but yet not exposing their private business, just exposing how the flows are going, and then in fact they do have the amounts of money that they say they have. I think that's a huge opportunity, and the first companies that opt to do it, it'll be hard, but the dividends will be there for them. There will never be concern that they are insolvent. There will never be concern that money is being spent in a way that doesn't make sense with what the reported uses are, because the flows are right out in the open.
Yeah, true transparency for the first time, right? Well, it was great having all three of you here today. Listeners, if you're interested, be sure to check out the Human Project as well as the Mastercoin Protocol. Google those. And I look forward to talking to you guys. Thanks a lot. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
This is Chris Joseph bringing you news on Next, the first true second-generation cryptocurrency for March 4th, 2014. 1 month earlier than planned, the Next project has gone fully open source. An early version of the source code was released on January 3rd, but since then, the code for Next has been completely refactored and rewritten. This announcement makes the current development stream completely open, including code for transparent forging, asset exchange, aliases, and the arbitrary messaging features. All of the source is hosted on Bitbucket, and you can access it through this shortened URL, bit.do/nxt. That's bit.do/next. In other news, keep an eye out for Next at the Texas Bitcoin Conference. The community has several pairs of boots on the ground and would love to chat. For more general information on Next, head to nextcrypto.org or mynxt.org. And stay tuned for more news on Next in the next Let's Talk Bitcoin broadcast.